personal view, I won't probably win many friends in the Liberal Party, I think it is absolutely indefensible for Australia, a prosperous country, to send children by themselves to another country. I think we are failing in humanity in doing that.
Scott Morrison, good morning, welcome.
Good morning, Barry.
How do you feel about that? Do you think we're failing in humanity by sending kids to Malaysia?
Well, this is the problem the government has with this policy. The government has basically created its own catch-22 here for itself. I mean, our policy was that everyone goes to Nauru and there are no exceptions because we can provide the facilities. Now, the government has found itself in a position if they make one exception, then that will become the rule. And they should have asked themselves this question before they signed up to this agreement. If they couldn't send everyone there, they should have walked away from this deal because they are presented with this exact choice. And that's why this is an ill-thought-through policy. And they've led themselves into their own cul-de-sac here, and whichever way they go, I think the position is worse off.
OK, but is it a reality? It's happening. What would you now do faced with this policy?
Well, this wouldn't be our policy, Barry, and I'm sure this policy will be exhausted by the time there's an election. So this really is a matter for the government. It's not a matter for the opposition. They've driven themselves into this cul-de-sac. It's for them to make a choice. Now, any exception will be an exception, and that's the problem they now face. And that will actually encourage kids to get on boats. Yeah, so the government has this choice.
You say it's a matter for the government, not the opposition, but Joe Hockey has strong views on this. Colin Barnett has strong views. They both say that these children should not be sent to Malaysia. What's your view?
Again, my view is that we would send people to Nauru, Barry, and that's what our alternative policy is. And I think if the government makes any exceptions here, then they undermine their own policy. And they can say it's not a blanket exemption. But the people, well, they think the people smugglers are going to go, oh, well, it's OK, Chris Bowen says it's only going to be this one time. So they have a serious problem with the credibility of this policy, with its design, and it's a policy problem of their own creation because of their anything but Nauru approach. So it's their Hobson's choice. They've created for themselves, and their only real option, I think, is to walk away from what is a diabolical failed policy.
But you're saying that they shouldn't make exceptions. If they were to make an exception, then clearly this would send the wrong signal, though, to the parents who have already done this and put their kids on the boats. It would only encourage them to do it further, wouldn't it?
But that's the point I'm making, Barry. They have created this problem for themselves. If Chris Bowen didn't think he could send every child to Malaysia, then he should have never signed up to this agreement. And this is why it's an agreement we've never been enthusiastic about from the start, because it presents these sorts of challenges. That's why, I mean, if you're going to have a policy in this area, it has to be simple, it has to be implementable, and it has to be consistent. And that's what our policy has always been. I can say that everyone who would come would go to Nauru because we can provide the facilities in Nauru for everyone who would come. Now, Chris Bowen can't say that, and he finds himself now in this situation where, you know, he may well send children, unaccompanied minors, to Malaysia, which is not something that, you know, I'm wildly excited about.
Yeah, but then you would be sending unaccompanied kids to Nauru if the parents treated the children in this way. Surely the answer is not...
But let me pick you up on that, Barry. Yes, I would, where they would go to public schools, where they would have access to health care, where they would be accommodated every night, and I would know where they are every single hour of every single day.
And that's broadly the arrangement in Malaysia, is it not?
No, Chris Bowen will have no idea where these people are. He'll have no idea. They won't go to public schools. They won't get access to the health care they'd get access to on Nauru. He can offer none of that. And if Chris Bowen didn't think he could send children to Malaysia, he should have never signed up to this deal.
Wouldn't the answer be to reunite these children with their parents and find out where they came from and send them back?
Well, I don't know how you would actually achieve that, Barry. I mean, who knows where their parents are and in what country they are and what arrangements you could have to send them back there. I mean, that is an even more difficult policy challenge. That's why I think these things have to be simple. And the government keeps getting themselves in trouble. I mean, they've recognised through this agreement their policies over the last 3 years have been the reasons the boats come. Despite all that talk of push factors for 3 years, this is an open admission that they are the reasons the boats came. Now, to respond to that, you've got to be clear, you've got to be consistent, you've got to think it through, and I don't think they've done that with this arrangement, and this dilemma proves it.
What do you make of their idea to film the deportation and then put it on YouTube? Do you think that will work? That'll send a message throughout the region?
Well, I don't think, honestly, a YouTube video is going to solve their credibility problems of the last 3 years. I mean, they can use whatever method they want to try and get the message out, but the problem is a bit with the message. I mean, this is a government that flips and flops. I mean, after the 7th of May, they said everyone who was coming to Australia would be transferred to another country. Then they had to backtrack. And every time they backtrack, every time they make an exception, every time they roll over on their own policy, well, they send the wrong message to people smugglers. And, you know, I want to stop the boats because it actually denies the sort of people you're talking about on the front page of The Age today at the point Annabelle made. That's why I'm so focused on this issue. But to do it, you've got to be consistent. And the government keeps tripping over itself in this area.
I want to ask you now, as your Shadow Minister for Productivity, about the retail figures, which are as bad as they've been for 50 years. How much of that is the fault of the retailers themselves?
Well, this is a very difficult environment, I think, for all business. And with the two-track economy, I mean, there's a lot of talk about issues in the mining sector and jobs there. But the real issue, I think, for jobs going forward will be in the retail sector. And why on earth you'd be putting on a carbon tax in the middle of these difficulties just is beyond belief. And I think that's the question people are asking, and particularly what we've seen in the United States in recent times and the more global uncertainty that's there, to go and create further difficulty is just madness.
But the Productivity Commission is saying that inflexibility in the industrial relations laws is part of the problem. They're talking there, of course, about wages in part. Does that give you then the green light to re-examine this issue?
Well, I think on productivity across a whole range of areas, there is a need for actual policy rather than the rhetoric we've seen from the government for the last few years. I mean, labour productivity is halved. I mean, it is half what it was just a few years ago. And what we've said about the retail inquiry is they should bring forward the review of the Fair Work Act. I mean, that's what the Commission has recommended. Now, that will produce whatever result it may produce, Barry, and we're not going to second-guess that outcome, but they should be bringing forward that review as a matter of urgency to address the issues of inflexibility that the Commission has highlighted.
There was a time when the Coalition's response to these sorts of problems would not be asking the government for a review. You would have views of your own.
Well, we do have views of our own, Barry, and we'll be outlining our practical views about IR before the next election. But there'll be practical views to address the needs that are there in the workplace. But at the moment, I mean, you've asked me about the Retail Productivity Commission report. They've said there should be a review of the Fair Work Act, and I think the government should act on that. I think it's a sensible recommendation, and they should do it now.
And should there be more flexibility in wages?
Well, I think addressing labour productivity is a critical issue. I mean, we can't have... What I want to see is real wage increases based on productivity improvements. And we're not seeing that at the moment. Basically, we've got wages driven by Dutch auctions and a strike first, talk later approach that is really becoming embedded in the workplace. And now we want to see, I think, an agenda driven by productivity in the workplace, and I don't think the government's arrangements are providing that environment. And I think that may be what a review of the Fair Work Act to date may produce.
There's going to be another test of productivity too with the aged care report coming out tomorrow. On this issue, would you be prepared to cut the government some slack, and if they really want to move to ensure that those who can afford it should pay more for aged care, that you would at least support them on that?
Well, look, I'll leave detailed comments about that to Peter Dutton, but I'd say this about the ageing sector. The ageing sector, and aged care in particular, has some real issues in terms of their labour force, and the difficulty of actually getting 457 workers into the labour force, particularly for aged care homes, I think is a real pressure point, and that's something I've been having a good look at and talking to the industry about, and I'm very receptive to try and address their labour needs to make sure we can get the people into these aged care facilities who can do the job and provide the care that we all want them to provide.
But the government needs to look at who pays just the same. The growth forecasts have been adjusted downwards. The budgetary pressures are going to be on in that area as well.
Yeah. Well, Glenn Stevens has knocked off a point off the economic growth forecast for this year, which takes us back to a trend growth. Now, I think this is going to put real pressure on the government's forecast for a surplus, and I think it's incumbent on the Treasurer to come out and say whether he still believes on these revised figures, whether they're going to hit that mark. Now, I note that in the outer years there is a different amendment that the bank has made. But nonetheless, I think what we're seeing globally and what we're seeing with the two-track economy in Australia, I think the pressure is really starting to hot up on the Treasurer's forecast for a surplus, and whether he'll be able to achieve that with what we're seeing now.
And for that very reason then, shouldn't the government be looking at issues like user pays in aged care?
Well, what I think they should be looking at, Barry, is abolishing their mad idea for a carbon tax. I mean, that is the thing that is undermining, I think, community confidence at the moment, that with the uncertainty of the way this government manages. And frankly, I don't think Julia Gillard's comment that, oh, trust us, we've got it all under control and you can trust our management, I don't think the Australian people share that confidence. And I think if she was to abolish this mad plan for a carbon tax, then I think people will be feeling a lot better about the future.
Your party seems to be having an internal argument about Malcolm Turnbull and his role. Did anything that he said at the press club on Wednesday particularly offend you?
No.
Then why was Nick Minchin admonishing him in the way that he did?
Well, I think you'd have to talk to Nick about that, but I really think the media are a little more excited about this than we are within the Parliamentary Liberal Party. I mean, Nick's he can write letters to the editor like any other Australian, but what I do know is that I think Malcolm's speech this week highlighted, the issues with the government's NBN, which is his primary task, and I think Malcolm really set it straight.
Because Nick Minchin says that Malcolm Turnbull is as obsessed about the Conservatives in the Liberal Party as the truth of the matter that Nick Minchin is obsessed about Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, I'll let Nick explain his own comments. I don't think Malcolm's obsessed about the Conservatives and the Liberal Party. I think Malcolm understands the events of late 2009 as well as anyone else. It was fundamentally a matter about policy, and that policy position now in the coalition, I think, is crystal clear. We, including Malcolm, are 100% opposed to this government's ridiculous carbon tax.
He does talk freely across all portfolios, as do a lot of shadow ministers and certainly a lot of ministers. That seems to have been a significant change in the way the politics works in this country over the last few years. Do you think that that's a good thing, or perhaps ministers and shadows should be a little more disciplined?
Well, look, I think it's as members of a shadow cabinet and wanting to be members of a cabinet, you consider a broad range of measures which are outside your portfolio, and you have views about these things. I think Malcolm has contributions to make, importantly in a lot of areas, as we all do. Now, we all exercise different levels of discipline in how we engage in those debates, but I thought Malcolm gave an excellent address to the press club this week, and I really welcome it, and I particularly welcome that strong focus he put on the NBN.
Scott Morrison, thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks a lot, Barry.